The reason your tomatoes are rotting from the bottom up is exactly because your plant looks so perfect. I know that sounds crazy, but that massive, dark green, healthy-looking tomato plant you're so proud of, it is actively starving its own fruit. One morning, you walk into the garden expecting to admire the first tomatoes of the season. You pick one up, turn it over, and your stomach drops. A black, leathery scar is spreading across the bottom. You tell yourself it's only one fruit. Then 2 days later, another tomato develops the same wound. Then another. Before most gardeners realize what's happening, they've already lost a large part of the harvest they've been waiting months for. And here's the frightening part. The advice almost everyone gives you may not solve the problem. You buy calcium, you crush eggshells, you add lime, you spray the leaves, and yet the rot keeps spreading. Why? Because in many gardens, the calcium is already there. The soil is full of it. Think about that. If the calcium already exists, why are the tomatoes acting as if they're starving? Why do eggshells fail? Why do calcium sprays fail? Why does blossom end rot often appear on the healthiest looking plants in the garden? The answer is hidden beneath the surface, and until you understand it, you can keep adding more and more calcium while the rot quietly spreads from fruit to fruit. Today, we're uncovering the invisible process most gardeners never see, the mistake that turns calcium-rich soil into a calcium-starved plant, and how to stop losing tomatoes before the damage reaches the rest of your harvest. 1. The most expensive gardening myth. If you've ever searched for blossom end rot online, you've probably seen the same advice repeated over and over again. Add calcium. It's one of the most common recommendations in gardening. And on the surface, it sounds completely logical. The black, sunken patch on the bottom of the tomato is often linked to a calcium shortage inside the fruit. So naturally, gardeners start looking for ways to add more calcium. They crush eggshells into the soil. They spread garden lime. They apply gypsum. Some even spray calcium directly onto the leaves. And for a moment, it feels like they're taking control of the problem. But then something frustrating happens. A week later, another tomato develops the same scar. Then another. Sometimes the rot appears even after calcium has already been added. That's the moment many gardeners begin doubting themselves. Did I not add enough? Did I buy the wrong product? Did I apply it too late? Before long, they're trying everything. More eggshells, more calcium spray, more lime, and yet the tomatoes keep rotting. That's usually when frustration turns into confusion. Because if calcium is supposed to solve the problem, why isn't it working? Here's what makes this so confusing. One gardener adds crushed eggshells every spring. Another sprays calcium every 2 weeks. A third spends money on premium supplements that promise stronger fruit and healthier plants. Yet all three can end up standing in their garden, turning over a tomato and staring at the exact same black scar. Different products, different methods, different budgets, the same result. That's the clue most people miss. What if the problem isn't the amount of calcium at all? What if something else is happening between the soil and the fruit? Because adding calcium and delivering calcium are not the same thing. Imagine a warehouse packed from floor to ceiling with food. Every shelf is full. Every corner is stocked. The supply is there. Now imagine every door is locked. The food exists, but nobody can reach it. To the starving people outside, a locked warehouse is no different than an empty one. And this is where the biggest misunderstanding begins. Many gardeners assume blossom end rot automatically proves the soil lacks calcium. But the fruit itself cannot tell you whether calcium is missing from the soil. It can only tell you that calcium never arrived where it was needed. That's a very different problem. And once you understand that distinction, a much bigger question appears. If calcium is already present, what is preventing it from reaching the fruit? And why does this invisible problem often appear on the healthiest looking tomato plants in the garden? 2. The journey of calcium. To understand what's really happening, we need to follow calcium on its journey through the plant. Think of every calcium particle in your garden as a package waiting to be delivered. The destination isn't the leaves. It isn't the stem. It's that developing tomato hanging quietly on the vine. Now here's the important part. Calcium can't move by itself, and it can't flow backward. It depends entirely on water to get where it needs to go. Water is the delivery truck. Every time the roots pull water from the soil, tiny calcium packages climb aboard for the ride. The trucks leave the root zone, they move through the stem, past the branches, toward the growing fruit. When everything works properly, the system is remarkably efficient. The soil provides the calcium, the roots load the trucks, the water carries the cargo, and the fruit receives exactly what it needs to build strong, healthy cells. But here's where the story changes. What happens when traffic slows down? Not enough to stop delivery completely, just enough to create a bottleneck. At first, nobody notices. The leaves still look healthy, the plant still grows, the flowers still open. But inside the fruit, a different story is unfolding. Because a tomato doesn't need calcium eventually, it needs calcium at the exact moment new cells are forming. Miss that window, and the damage begins long before the first black scar appears. So what is creating the bottleneck before the calcium ever reaches the fruit? 3. The hidden bottleneck. Most gardeners imagine calcium deficiency as a missing ingredient. But we're not looking at an empty warehouse. We're looking at a traffic jam. Think about the journey we just followed. The soil holds the packages. The water is the truck. The stem becomes the highway. And the fruit is the final destination. Here's the surprising part. The highway doesn't have to collapse completely to ruin your harvest. It only has to slow down. If a delivery truck is delayed, even for a few hours during a hot afternoon, the fruit misses its window to build new cells. A healthy root system means nothing if the trucks aren't moving. And this is where most gardeners make their most costly mistake. They focus on the calcium itself. They keep adding more boxes to the warehouse, when they should be looking at the highway, because the real question isn't how much calcium is in the soil, it's what is causing the traffic jam? And once you start asking that question, the true culprit finally reveals itself. Water. 4. Why watering causes rot. Water is often the first hidden bottleneck. And the surprising part is that the problem usually isn't too little water. It's inconsistency. Picture a tomato plant in the middle of a hot summer week. The soil becomes dry. Tiny cracks begin to appear on the surface. The roots slow down. The delivery trucks carrying calcium begin moving more slowly. Day after day, the fruit keeps growing. But fewer calcium packages are arriving. Then the gardener notices the soil is dry and does what most of us would do. They water heavily. The soil becomes saturated. The roots suddenly wake up. Water rushes through the plant. The fruit begins expanding rapidly. And that's where the problem begins. Because fruit growth can speed up almost immediately. Calcium delivery cannot. Imagine trying to supply bricks to a construction site. If the building suddenly doubles in size overnight, the delivery trucks can't instantly double their speed. The same thing happens inside the tomato. The fruit grows faster than calcium can arrive. And for a brief but critical period, the developing cells begin to fall behind. From the outside, it looks like a massive success. The plant is thriving. The tomatoes are finally plumping up. But inside the fruit, a silent shortage has already formed. That's why blossom end rot often appears a week or two after a cycle of dry soil, followed by heavy watering. The damage isn't happening when you see the black scar. It's happening days earlier, when growth outruns delivery. And once you understand that, a surprising realization follows. The issue isn't always how much water the plant receives. It's how predictable that water supply is. But water isn't the only thing capable of slowing the trucks. Sometimes, even when the soil moisture is perfect, the bottleneck still appears. 5. The heat trap nobody talks about. But what if the soil moisture is already consistent? What if you're watering correctly, and the tomatoes still develop blossom end rot? This is where things get even more surprising. Because sometimes the bottleneck isn't in the soil at all. It's happening above ground. Picture a tomato plant on a hot summer afternoon. The sun is intense. The leaves are warm to the touch. The air feels dry, and the plant is losing water every second through thousands of tiny pores on its leaves. Suddenly, the delivery trucks are moving faster than ever. But they're not all heading toward the fruit. They're heading toward the leaves. Because when temperatures rise, the plant's first priority is survival, not fruit production. Survival, the leaves begin pulling enormous amounts of water upward just to stay cool. And wherever the water goes, calcium follows. Think of it as a competition. On one side, the leaves. On the other side, the developing fruit. Both need water, both need calcium. But during extreme heat, the leaves always win. And this is the ultimate irony. Gardeners love seeing massive, lush tomato plants with enormous dark green leaves. But the more leaves a plant has, the more water those leaves will steal from the fruit on a hot day. The trucks are still moving. They're just delivering to the wrong address. That's why even the most perfectly watered garden can still fall victim to blossom end rot during a heat wave. Not because calcium disappeared, not because the soil failed, but because the plant simply shifted its priorities. And if heat and water aren't the only things affecting delivery, what happens when the root system itself starts slowing the trucks? 6. The root damage problem. But what if the trucks are ready and the highway is clear? What if the problem starts at the loading dock itself? Every calcium delivery begins underground, and because roots are buried out of sight, we often assume they are fine. But below the surface, the loading dock easily breaks down. Sometimes, the soil becomes compacted from heavy rain or foot traffic. Roots find themselves pushing against concrete. Water uptake slows. Calcium deliveries slow with it. Other times, the damage comes from physical injury. A shovel cuts too close. A stake is driven into the dirt. Even aggressive weeding can destroy the microscopic feeder roots responsible for loading the trucks. Then there's the invisible threat, salt buildup. Too much fertilizer leaves behind concentrated salts, making it harder for roots to pull in water. Add waterlogged soil into the mix, and the roots begin to suffocate from lack of oxygen. The trucks don't stop, they simply load more slowly. The damage happens underground, long before the first symptom reaches the fruit. But roots and water aren't the only things capable of overwhelming the delivery system. Sometimes, the gardener creates the bottleneck with the best intentions possible. 7. When more fertilizer makes it worse. And now we arrive at the most counterintuitive cause of all. Too much fertilizer. It sounds backwards. We're taught that a fast-growing tomato plant is a healthy tomato plant. More leaves, more flowers, more growth. What's not to like? But what happens when growth begins to outpace delivery? That's exactly what excess nitrogen does. The plant responds with explosive growth. A thick, dark green canopy quickly takes over the garden. At first, it looks like a massive success. Maybe the leaves are finally the deep green you've been hoping for. Maybe the plant is growing faster than it ever has. Maybe, for the first time all season, it feels like everything is finally working. That's what makes this mistake so easy to miss. Because every new leaf, every new stem, every new flower demands water and calcium immediately. Suddenly, the delivery trucks are spread too thin. The highway is overloaded. And when demand rises faster than delivery, something has to be left behind. Almost always. It's the fruit. This is the ultimate irony. The gardener adds fertilizer to help. The plant grows exactly as expected. And that very success creates the bottleneck. The plant isn't weak. It's just growing faster than its own supply chain can support. That's why some of the most vigorous tomato plants in the garden can still develop blossom end rot. Not because they're starving, because they're growing faster than the delivery system can keep up. And once you understand that, a much bigger question appears. If water, heat, roots, and fertilizer can all overwhelm the delivery system, how can you tell whether your garden is facing a true calcium shortage or a calcium delivery failure? 8. The simple diagnostic test. At this point, you might be wondering, so how do I know which problem I'm actually dealing with? Is my garden truly lacking calcium, or is the delivery system failing? The good news is that there's a simple way to start narrowing it down. Think back over the last few weeks and ask yourself a few questions. Did the weather swing between dry soil and heavy watering? Did a heat wave arrive just before the first signs of blossom end rot appeared? Did you recently apply a high nitrogen fertilizer and notice a burst of rapid growth? Was the soil compacted, waterlogged, or disturbed around the roots? If you answered yes to even one of those questions, you're probably not looking at a calcium shortage. You're looking at a delivery problem. And that's an important distinction, because many gardeners immediately reach for calcium products when the real issue is somewhere else in the chain. Now let's look at the other side. Has the garden received very little organic matter for years? Has calcium never been added through compost, lime, gypsum, or other soil amendments? Are multiple crops showing signs of poor growth, not just tomatoes? If so, a genuine calcium deficiency becomes more likely. But here's the surprising pattern. In many home gardens, true calcium shortages are less common than people think. Delivery failures are often the real culprit. That's why two gardeners can see the same black scar on a tomato while facing completely different underlying causes. One needs more calcium, the other needs better delivery. And treating those two problems the same way often leads to frustration. So before you add another product to the soil, ask yourself one question. Am I trying to increase the supply or fix the delivery system? Because that single question changes everything. And once you start thinking that way, the solution becomes much clearer. At the beginning of this video, we started with a simple question. If the soil already contains calcium, why are the tomatoes still rotting? Most gardeners spend years looking for the answer in a bag, a bottle, or a new supplement. More calcium, more products, more treatments. But as we've seen, blossom end rot is often telling a very different story. The fruit isn't necessarily showing you a nutrient problem. It's showing you a delivery problem, a problem with water, a problem with heat, a problem with roots, a problem with growth outpacing supply. That's why two tomato plants can show the exact same black scar, while suffering from completely different causes. And that's the shift that changes everything. The old question was, how much calcium is in the soil? The better question is, can the calcium actually reach the fruit? Because once you start asking that question, you stop chasing symptoms. You start fixing systems. And that's where healthier plants, healthier fruit, and better harvests usually begin. The next time you turn over a tomato and see that first dark scar forming, don't just ask what's missing, ask what's being blocked. Because the most surprising part of this entire mystery is that, in many gardens, the calcium was there all along.